Sometime later, we have the Israelite monarchy begin. There's King Saul. His dynasty is very short-lived. We have King David established. The days of David and his son Solomon are often called the Golden Age of Israel. After Solomon's death, the kingdom is split in two. We have a northern kingdom and a southern kingdom. Then the northern, both kingdoms have a bad problem with idolatry, but it's worse in the northern kingdom. After a while, this great, big, huge, mighty empire comes into existence. Well, it existed, but becomes very mighty. It becomes like the top dog in the ancient world. The Assyrian Empire, with its capital in Nineveh. Nineveh conquers the northern kingdom, takes them away into captivity and throughout their mighty empire, and they almost capture the southern kingdom. They almost conquer the southern kingdom, but they don't. And that's in the days of King Hezekiah. So the northern kingdom in around 735 BC is carried away into captivity. The southern kingdom continues, but while there's periodic revivals, they persist in idolatry, and ultimately they are taken into captivity by, as time would have it, the Assyrian Empire falls, as empires do, to the Babylonian Empire. So the Babylonian Empire becomes top dog. They go, and Nebuchadnezzar the second, in what we call the Neo-Babylonian Empire, conquers the southern kingdom. He sacks Jerusalem in 586 BC. He carries the Israelites away into captivity in Babylon. They spend 70 years there. Within that 70 years, the Babylonian Empire is a little bit short-lived too. They are conquered by the Medo-Persian Empire. A Persian king named Cyrus allows the Jewish people to return back into Israel. Some of them do, some of them don't. So we have dispersion Jews, but then we also have Jews in Israel. And so they make their way back into Israel. Somewhere along the line, Rome becomes the dominant world power. We have Greece in between Persia and Rome, but then Rome becomes the dominant world power, and Jesus of Nazareth is born into what? Israel in the 1st century. And then, ultimately, within 33 years, give or take, of his birth, he is crucified. We believe he rose again, and his followers take his message back into these areas, but also to the left off the map where we can't see. So other places in the ancient world factor in, don't have that on the map. But that's the biblical story. It's pretty tight. I mean, there's a lot more data there, but that is the history of Israel. If you just say, the Bible tells me so, and that's good enough for me, nothing wrong with that. But in and around the 18th and 19th centuries, we have some dudes in Europe, particularly in Germany, but in Europe, generally speaking, a bunch of highly educated white people. All right, and I'm not saying, I'm only saying that because in Europe in the 18th and 19th centuries, highly educated white people thought they knew everything and nobody else knew anything, and it hasn't changed a lot. So we're still dealing with it. Julius Wellhausen looked at the Old Testament, and Wellhausen thought he was a biblical, a historical critic, and he just thought, more or less arbitrarily, forgive me for saying, but without any sort of data, I don't think the Old Testament history is really the way it went down. And he took particular issue with the fact that traditionally it was believed that the first 5 books of the Bible, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, were written by Moses. Jesus says that in the Gospels. Do a word search on the name Moses in the Gospels, and you'll find that Jesus attributed these 5 books to Moses. So it'd be kind of a big deal from the perspective of scriptural authority and whatnot if Moses did not write the Pentateuch. Here is, oh man, you can't see all of that, it'll do. Not a great slide, sorry. Here is Wellhausen's theory. It is called the documentary hypothesis, also known as the JEDP theory. And Wellhausen posited no data at all other than the Old Testament himself. He looked at these different different names of God and these different ceremonies and stuff in the Pentateuch. And he said, I think that the first 5 books of the Bible were actually a bunch of different documents that came from these different groups of men. He had the Yahwist or Jehovah's source, the people who called God Yahweh, or as that needs to be pronounced, Jehovah. There's another name for God used in the Pentateuch called Elohim. So we thought these were different religious groups, the Yahwist and the Elohists, or he would have said the Jehovah's. Then some of the law material, like the thou shalt not do this and the thou shalt not do that, he called that the Deuteronomic source. He thought that there was this other group of people who really liked these laws, and they were into that sort of thing. And then he posited that there was this priestly group, and they were really into ceremonies, animal sacrifices, and wearing the right kind of fabric. So he said that there were 4 different religious streams that were different religious movements, but a later redactor, which means a later editor, somehow these different groups got coalesced into one, and somebody took all their documents and amalgamated them into one document. So, Wellhausen basically said that the Pentateuch is a patchwork, a quilt of a bunch of different documents, rather than being a literary unity written by one person, a quilt work written by a whole bunch of different groups. Very, very different than what we have when God gives the law to Moses. And there are even versions of this that are taught in some evangelical universities. So, this is really locked in. This theory is still taught in many, if not most, universities, and it's just taken as actual factual truth. It's taught as though it were this factual truth. This is just the way it happened. An observation from our buddy Kenneth Kitchen. I'm going to give a few others, and some of his quotes are zingers. But first point. This whole idea of there being this patchwork of ancient documents from all these different groups that were later amalgamated into one document and then made to look as though it were some sort of a literary unity, that process, there's not any process like that anywhere in the ancient world. In other words, you have to, at least by anything we've been able to validate, that was just never done anywhere. All right, and so you're arguing for a process that's never been seen, that Wellhausen just essentially made up, and arguing that's something that had to have happened because Julius Wellhausen said it, and it's been taught in all these universities for a really long time. Here's another quote from Kenneth Kitchen. I'm going to give a few, and just because he's really taken this apart. He said at that time, and by that he means Wellhausen's time, there were no Armana letters, only found in 1887. No Code of Hammurabi of Babylon, some of you probably heard of that one, only dug up in 1901. No Siloam inscription, only found in 1880. No Hittites, no systemic archaeology by Strata. Large-scale scientific archaeology lay far in the future, unimaginable. He's talking about all these archaeological excavations. No Ugarit, no Hurrian, no Fast Ebla, no Mari, Ugarit, Emar archives from outside Mesopotamia. None of this stuff existed. Now, these archaeological digs, these discoveries have brought to light a lot of documents with which we can compare the Old Testament documents, and these were unknown in Wellhausen's time. So Kitchen continues. Wellhausen worked in a near vacuum and could speculate freely. Kitchen isn't mincing words, but it's kind of helpful when a guy doesn't mince words. But that day has long, long since gone. Today we do have the vast resources hinted at just above, and they do enable us to profile ancient history accurately in its broad sweep. And straight bottom-to-top evolution is out. It never happened like that, no, not ever. This final scheme pumped into generations of students, both future and practicing biblicist, is, alas, and always was, pure, unadulterated fantasy. Now, he uses the word evolution. A couple of weeks ago, we had this talk about biological evolution. That's not what he's talking about. Whether we around here, we don't believe in evolution, at least, Jay and I don't, and you really should join us in that. But least not if it's presented from the perspective of, a lot of people. We could, it's another discussion. That's not what Kitchen's talking about here. He's talking about this JEDP theory fits in this broader way of looking at history. When Darwin's theory of biological evolution came out, people took that and they applied it to every other discipline. History was an evolution. Particularly for our purposes here, history was an evolution. And so, for example, we believe that God created the world. Adam was the first man. He knew there was one God. But a historical construct often kind of peddled is this idea that polytheism came first, and then that evolved into monotheism and enter things like the redaction for the Pentateuch. And then, what comes after monotheism? Agnosticism, atheism. That would seem like the natural order. Kitchen really blasts that. Just talking about the way history works. History doesn't evolve. History goes back and forth. How often have we heard history repeats itself? All right? So what goes around comes around. There's not this evolving history. And once that comes into question, we realize that Wellhausen was just really claiming that a lot of things happened that just didn't really happen. Now, how does this fit into the documents of the Pentateuch? Here is the reality. When we started to make, now when I say we, I read the books, all right? I wasn't at any of the archaeological digs, and my degrees are not in archaeology, so I just didn't want to say it. But I can read fairly well, I think. And there's a lot of good data that you and I can access. And what was discovered is that the Pentateuch actually fits into a well-known literary genre in the ancient world. It is a covenant treaty document genre. And here is the deal. Without going into all of the data, because there's way too much data to go through, we have covenant treaties hundreds of years before the time when Moses would have lived, 1450 to 1250, depending on where you date this. And we have covenant treaties going all the way into the days of the Babylonian captivity. Covenant treaties are treaties between nations. There's deities involved. There's rules involved. Some of them are treaties between people and deities, where deities establish laws. And so there's these covenants, these treaties, and they fit this literary genre that fits the Pentateuch in the Old Testament like hand in glove. But here's the thing. Let me give you an illustration for what I'm about to say. When I was in theological seminary, we had to use the right writing format, Turabian format. There's a few different writing formats we use today. There's MLA, there's Turabian, there's APA, there's all these different things. And here's what drives me nuts about Turabian format. I think they're like on the 11th edition of the Turabian manual by now, right? And it's not any better or worse than, say, the first edition, right? You have to get good grades, like 25% of your grade on your theology paper or whatever discipline you're in, is like doing the Turabian format, right? And it changes with every edition, and you're like, why? But in a fairly similar way, only it happened a lot slower, covenant treaty formats changed with the flow of history. What a covenant treaty format looked like in 1500 BC was different than 1100 BC, was different than 800 BC, was different than 600 BC. So far, so good. So, when we compare the Pentateuch to covenant treaty formats, what do we find? The Old Testament Moses and ancient Near Eastern treaties. This is Kitchen again. This is actually Kitchen's, I'm relying on him a lot again. This is probably his best specialty, ancient Near Eastern covenant treaties, and very well equipped to relate this to the Old Testament. Sinai and its two renewals, especially the version in Deuteronomy, belong squarely within phase 5. You want to know what phase 5 is? He tells you. Within 1400 through 1200, that would be BC, and no other date. The impartial and very extensive evidence, for instance, 30 Hittite documents and versions, says this matter beyond any further dispute. It is not my creation, it is inherent in the mass of the original documents themselves and cannot be gainsaid, and the brute facts are to be respected. Here is the point he's making. Typically, those who espouse the JEDP theory are going to think that the Pentateuch in its present form was put together not in, say, 1200 to 1400 BC, but sometime quite a bit later than that, say the 600 or 700s BC or something. We'll talk about something called minimalism in a minute. The issue here is that it doesn't fit the treaty format of those time periods. It fits the treaty format when, from a biblical perspective, Moses would have lived. And so this it's not surprising, I think, that God would communicate in ways that would be understood in their culture and against their cultural background. This really blows out of the water, this idea of a JEDP theory, because these documents were written as the documents they were, and it really puts the dating of the Pentateuch well within the time frame you would expect it to be in. Now, I do want to acknowledge one point. Kitchen says 1400 to 1200. The earliest date, because there's a debate about the date of the Exodus, as in when Moses and the Israelites went out of Egypt. And the earliest date for the Exodus would be 1446, which would be, 46 years before 1400. All right, but you also have to understand that this didn't work. So this might, Kitchen's claims might be, you might try to say that's a minor problem for people who want the earliest date of the Exodus, and that's something you have to completely work through, whether you favor the earlier or later date. However, 46 years isn't a lot. And here's how it didn't work. Kitchen kind of oversimplifies a little because this is what people do because you have to. It's not like until 1500, I don't know, 1590, what is it? I'm doing this backward. until 1400, they were written this way, and then all of a sudden, within 1 year, the format changed. I mean, there would have been some gradual change here between the formatting and stuff, so it's really not much of a problem, even if we're going to date the Exodus at 1446. And of course, Moses didn't write these the day they got out of Egypt, and Moses lived a very, very, very long time, and probably would have, even if the Exodus had been in 1446, he would have probably composed this sometime close to 1400. So it's really not a problem. That's very, very close. But it's a huge problem if you want to try to put the composition of the Pentateuch into like 650 BC or something like that. The other thing, and here's something else Kitchen says, we do want to acknowledge that Moses is not explicitly mentioned in ancient Egyptian documents. Now, why wouldn't the pharaohs have mentioned Moses? The main reason you would write things in inscription, unless we're talking about actual covenant treaty documents, the main reason you would write things in inscriptions is when you conquered an enemy. Right? Check it out. I tore this guy apart. We're going to look at a lot of inscriptions as we go on that have to do with one person successfully conquering another people or a successful raid or something like that. When you got it handed to you, you didn't want to set that down for posterity. In other words, the ancient Egyptians didn't want to make records of great defeats. All right? You're not going to find those in ancient Egypt. There's not records of, we got tanked by the Hittites in this battle or something. That just doesn't happen. There is, if you want to do the research, we don't have time to go into this, there is some data to support the 10 plagues. But Moses as an individual, he doesn't show up in ancient Egyptian documents. However, here is something Kenneth Kitchen says about how all of this relates to Moses. He essentially says that if the Hebrew Bible didn't provide us with a Moses figure, we'd practically have to make one up to have a figure that would fit these documents. To explain, he says, what exists in our Hebrew documents, we need a Hebrew leader who had experience in life in Egyptian court, mainly in the East Delta, hence Pyramesses. Kitchen goes into a lot more detail as to why, including knowledge of treaty-type documents and their format, as well as traditional legal social usage familiar to his own folk. In other words, somebody distressingly like that old hero of the biblical tradition, Moses, is badly needed at this point to make any sense of the situation as we have it. Here's what Kitchen is saying. Hebrew slaves in 1400 to 1200 BC and then around there, I know this is hard to believe, but they didn't train the slaves in how to write out treaties in the correct format and things like that. All right, that wasn't the kind of thing you trained the Hebrew slaves in. Somebody in the court, somebody who's actually involved in geopolitics and interactions between Egypt and her neighboring nations. These are the kind of people who would have been trained in that. And that is the format in which we find the Pentateuch. Now, you put that together with the fact that the Pentateuch is also very sensitive to the religious sensibilities of the Hebrew people. And what Kitchen is arguing is that from a historical standpoint, you need somebody who understands the Hebrew religion and understands ancient covenant treaties in this specific time period. That sounds a lot like the biblical Moses. So he's just arguing that while Moses isn't explicitly mentioned by name, when you put together all the data, you really need a Moses figure to make sense out of what we got. Certainly a lot of other things go into this. As I said, we got a water ski here a little bit and just scratch the surface. But the simple answer is that the JBDP theory just can't account for ancient Near Eastern covenant treaty formats and the time periods they would fit in. Now, in Kitchen's book, there's a lot of very good charts that show these parallels. So, yeah, not difficult stuff to follow. All right.
Can I ask
Please, before we go on, absolutely.
I want to make sure I'm understanding what exactly covenant treaties, because that's a new concept for me.
Okay.
Is it more about the structure of, say, a contract, which is something I understand well, because there's a certain structure from a legal point of view? Is it more of that, or is it more just grammar and syntax and how the writing was done at that time?
It's more of a contract format. I could probably, if I could find the right page here and actually, I know this is kind of nerdy, but if I think I've got I could probably get to the right page really quick to kind of show the, yeah. Well, it may take me more time than I want. Big book here, I thought I had it place marked, and maybe I don't. Anyway, but it basically has to do with, Randy, the structure, the way it's introduced, and the order in which, okay, here we go. I found it. Ta-da! So, we have in the Sinaitic Covenant, as comparing with the Hittite corpus, and these are a lot of these documents between the Hittites and Egypt. Incidentally, the Hittites and the Egyptians were kind of the major players in the geopolitical structure. Incidentally, in Wellhausen's day, they didn't believe the Hittites even existed. They thought that the Hittites were a mythological people invented in the Hebrew scriptures. Then, all of a sudden, the archaeological evidence shows that the Hittites were a major world power. So Julius Wellhausen didn't believe in Hittites. And, I guess didn't believe in God either. So, hey, for example, begins with a title, and then we've got a historical prologue. My writing is very Anyways, and then it goes. There's reading, there's witnesses, there's blessings, and there's curses. And so that's the kind of thing we're talking about. I'm not going to write all of that out just for time, but the order in which the treaty document is laid out. These are the literary features we find in the Pentateuch. Now, of course, I believe that God gave Moses this data, right? But we do understand that Moses didn't receive Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, and Deuteronomy all in the 40 days of Mount Sinai. He comes down with the stone tablets that have the Ten Commandments, and everything else is an elaboration on the Ten Commandments. Moses obviously spent a goodly amount of time putting this together, and if you understand biblical divine inspiration of authors, you understand that we believe that God worked through the education and understanding that these authors had. For example, the Apostle Paul was trained as a Pharisee. While he disagreed with the Pharisees a lot, his Pharisaic training is evident in his writings. We see that with all kinds of different figures. And so this is the sort of thing, the sort of formatting is the kind of thing that you need somebody like Moses to understand, that Hebrew slaves, generally speaking, wouldn't have. So, yeah.
Have you heard that what necessitated a suzerain-vassal covenant was these were very dangerous times, and a vassal didn't want to be used as a human shield and locked out of a fortress city, and so a covenant would allow the suzerain to promise the vassals, I'll let you in the city and I'll commit my troops to your defense. I'm not going to use you as human shields. In some ways, that was a precursor to feudal Europe.
Yeah.
The serfs and the tenant farmers were promised protection by the feudal lords.
Right. We see this all over the place. In fact, in Genesis 15, and we're not even dealing with this. In Genesis 15, God makes what we call a suzerain vassal, and a suzerain is essentially a ruler or a king. A suzerain vassal treaty. God essentially makes one with Abraham that very much fits that time period when Abraham would have lived, and that's that the cutting the animals in half and walking through the trail and so on. Yeah, very good. This is really common stuff in the ancient world, and it has to do with a lot of things, Randy, and everybody has to do with literary genre in a certain time frame. When was this kind of literature around, and how was this kind of literature composed? And it wasn't composed by taking a bunch of ancient religious documents and amalgamating them. And so,
And by that, I think, and I don't know if to say this, apologies if so, there's this cohesion and a consistency to writing that I think supports a single author.
absolutely. I think we got some serious what we call literary unity going on here. And, yeah. Now there was, the data it did have later editing going on, and nobody denies that. But understand, the fundamentalists don't deny that it was edited over the years. So you have occasional phrases like, and this still exists to this day, probably a day later than Moses. But that something was edited doesn't deny the original author. Miriam?
I have a question about, so if you're saying that the fact that the format of the Old Testament, like these 5 books, matches with the format of a lot of books and signed and reports, like historical accuracy. But couldn't it go the other way? So a lot of people say that because there were so many other similar documents, that this is just another document. It doesn't mean that what's written is actually accurate, or that the God of that story is actually.
Yeah, we certainly need to understand, and just in case, I'm going to sort of repeat what you said so that for our people online, just in case that didn't pick that up. The fact that these documents exist and sets it in a literary context of that time period, it does show that it does maybe get away from what we might call some uniqueness. It shows that, assuming God was working, he was working in a literary template that was common in the day. And some people might want to come to that and say, well, that gets away from the fact that this was by divine inspiration, because people were putting together these kind of documents all the time. I don't think that necessarily proves or disproves the divine inspiration of the matter. I think we want to do other things. The main reason I bring this up, so you could try to make that argument, but historical critics their general argument has been to invalidate this document in this time frame and being put together in this way. So what this does show us is that the premise that the Pentateuch is of late composition and couldn't have been written by one person and was from all these different sources. And so what you're saying isn't what's usually taught in the universities. It's usually Wellhausen. What this does is it allows us to put Wellhausen in the garbage can, which is kind of a big... then we would have to have a discussion. It seems to me, studying the Bible, that it usually does, most of the Bible does fit into a contemporary literary context. If you feel like that invalidates the divine inspiration of Scripture, I just don't think it necessarily does. For instance, if I use when I preach sermons on Sunday mornings, if I use methods that I've learned in a speech class, I don't think that necessarily invalidates whether the Holy Spirit is working through my delivery. But I mean, I guess you could say, it's a fair point of fencing if we wanted to say that.
Yeah. One of the doctrines associated with Scripture is the doctrine of perspicuity or perspicuousness. That means that God has cast his self-revelation in a way that the author's intent is accessible without a great deal of circumnavigation. Therefore, think about every single parable Jesus gave is cast in the cultural forms of the day. So also, the Pentateuch was cast in cultural forms of the day. Part of this is because of the doctrine of perspicuity. God communicates in a language that's known and in this cultural form is recognized.
So if a scholar came to me and said, okay, I see what you're saying about the data, we need a Moses-like figure to have written the Pentateuch, but that still doesn't mean that it comes from God. Thank you for acknowledging that we needed a Moses figure for the Pentateuch, is about how I feel about that. But, so you can always, and this isn't against you, but it's against, a skeptic is always going to, how do you say, is always going to fence, is always going to try to parry and come up with another means of attack. But the fact that the main attack for hundreds of years has been deflated is kind of a mammoth thing in this context.
Yeah, just one more time. Out of heart commitments come the presuppositions that condition the way you come to the text. They're not coming to the text out of objectivity, they're coming to the text because of heart commitments that determine their presuppositions.
So, very, very good questions, and I do want to dialogue about this stuff. I do want to talk about David a little, just because. So I'm gonna move on past the documents. This is really a really good discussion, and it merits a lot of study on your part and a lot of thought. I mean, how does all this fit together? But let me talk a little bit about minimalism. Here's the deal. This goes right hand in hand with Wellhausen and the JEDP theory. A lot of people want to say that the Pentateuch, as well as the books of 1st and 2nd Samuel and most of 1st and 2nd Kings, were written sometime in the life of King Josiah. So, yay for King Josiah. The very few people are doubting whether King Josiah was a real historical figure. Now, if you're not familiar with the biblical figure Josiah, look him up, and what you'll find is in the days of Josiah, he became king at 8 years old. He died young. It's rough. He shouldn't have gone to war with Egypt when God told him not to. Putting all of that aside, there was a great revival in his day, and what happened was they started cleaning up the temple. The temple was a wreck, and when they were cleaning up the temple, they found the book of the law, as it's recorded in the Hebrew Bible, right? And Josiah wept, and he was like, we haven't been keeping this law, we got to start keeping the law. He smashed all the idolatrous altars. There's this wonderful revival in Israel. Enter our minimalist friends who are schooled in Julius Wellhausen, and they want to late date the Bible, and basically they wanted to say, well, most of the history of the nation of Israel in the Old Testament is pseudo-history. It didn't really happen. So what they say is, here's what King Josiah did. King Josiah wanted to centralize authority in the kingdom of Judah in Jerusalem. The best way to do this was to make Jerusalem a center of worship. So he had his minions, he had his buddies cook up all of these documents, some of them putting together some stuff from these ancient, different rival groups, the Yahwists and the Jehovahs, but do this redaction on those documents and basically make up a pseudo-history to claim that Israel has this illustrious history. Now, this is also taught in many universities. So here's the story. I'm going to go through this fast, and you can look at it yourself. 2 Kings 22, 8, 13. There's the biblical story. They're reading between the lines and saying Josiah had his boys make up a bunch of history, make up a bunch of documents. All right? So here is where this really comes down. Now, this basically would invalidate all kinds of history, all kinds of Old Testament history. We don't have time for all of it, but I want to focus on King David because, according to the original minimalism, King David was a mythological figure. A lot like some people might think. British historians debate whether there was really a King Arthur, right? And even if there was, they think, well, he's probably not like the legends paint him. He might have been some tribal chieftain in some boondock backwater place. So, according to a biblical timeline, King David would have ruled Israel about 1010 to 970 BC, 40 years according to the biblical timeline. He established a vast kingdom in Palestine, which was then taken over by his son Solomon. This would have been the golden age of Israel. So minimalism would say that the golden age of Israel is mythology. King David either didn't really exist, a mythological figure, or others suggest that he was some kind of small-time tribal chieftain. He ruled a couple of huts, and he was greatly embellished. I read an article like that. I wish I didn't have time to find this article, but it was I think it was in like Time Magazine or something, some article about supposedly, King David was just some rinky-dink, chief of a rabble of a handful of people and all this great mythology. Well, this is another case where archaeology just doesn't support where it shows that the minimalists are doing pseudo-history. This is, Kenneth Kitchen will talk about Tel Dan, but he's writing in 2004. In 2011, a very important inscription was discovered in Tel Dan. Now, let me say something about Israelite history before I go on. I'm not going to go all the way back to that map because that's too many slides. But one of the things you'll notice if you think about that is Israel had a purpose before God, which would have been to be a light to the surrounding nations. And Israel was also told by God that if they disobeyed him, they would be disciplined by being conquered and carried away by foreign nations. So far, so good. Israel's central location on what is called the King's Highway, the way you had to travel if you're going from, say, Babylon to Egypt or Egypt to Babylon, it made it a really convenient place to reach those nations or for those nations to travel to Israel if they wanted to learn about the God of Israel. It also made it a really convenient nation for a really convenient location for foreign nations to come in and kick their booty, pardon my language, if that was what God had in mind. Because of that, Israel was great. Different places in Israel, building structures, inscriptions, things like that were razed to the ground, were destroyed again and again and again by the Assyrians, by the Babylonians, by all of these different invading forces, by the Syrians at other times. And so, it's not surprising that we don't have a dump truck load of archaeological data from, say, the Kingdom of David and Solomon like we would wish we had, because, frankly, you think about all the times in history that Jerusalem, for instance, has been destroyed. It's a lot. It really is a lot. However, Tel Dan, here is, let me go on with a little bit about Tel Dan. Here is what Tel Dan says. This is a Syrian, not Assyrian. Syria is right above Israel. Assyria is over here, more like modern day Iran, in and around there. And so Syria is the same location as Syria is today. So that's an easy one. There's this Syrian king by the name of Hazael. He is mentioned in the Bible. And here's what Hazael brags He says, I killed Joram, the son of Ahab, and Ahaziah, the son of Jehoram, in the house of David. This inscription is 841 BC. Now, if David lived, just go back here, if David is at 1070 to 970, you can see that this is within a couple of hundred years of the historical David. And the key phrase here is house of David, validating that he was, not only was there an actual house or dynasty of David, these are the same names we've got in the Hebrew Bible, and David's house, David's dynasty was a big enough deal, it was important enough that Hazael would brag about having conquered David's descendants. Just for kicks, grins, and giggles, we understand that kings usually didn't kill people themselves, right? If we were to say that President Trump is going to go to war with Vladimir Putin, well, I think everybody's, let's say Kim Jong-un, right? They're not going to get in a boxing ring together, right? These dictators, or well, President Trump is a president, but you guys aren't going to get in a boxing ring together. They have minions who are going to kill people. So when Hazael brags about killing these people, he didn't do it himself. It just so happens he had this henchman by the name of Jehu, who had formerly been under the thumb of King Ahab and his royal dynasty, and he kind of switched his loyalty because he wanted to rule in the region. All of that to say, so once we realize that, once we understand that Hazael, who is mentioned in this context, isn't the guy who did the killing himself, but he's bragging about it on his stela here, we see that this fits hand in glove with the biblical story. Oh my goodness, I didn't give you a reference for that. That's in, it mentions 2 Kings 8, where Hazael is killed Ben-Hadad, who was anointed by Elisha. But, sorry, no reference here. I'm pretty sure this is actually in chapter 9, 2 Kings. But, in and around there, again, for time constraints, let me just get to the meat here. Then Jehu drew his bow with his full strength and shot Joram between the shoulders, and the arrow pierced his heart, and he sank in his chariot. That is the king in the northern kingdom that Hazael is bragging about killing. And then, same names here. Ahaziah, the king of Judah, incidentally, Judah is the Davidic dynasty here. Ahaziah, the king of Judah, saw this. He fled in the direction of Beth-Hagan, and Jehu pursued him and said, shoot him also. They shot him in the chariot, and they sent him to Gur, which is Iclium, and he fled to Megiddo and died. This is within a handful of generations from King David, within a couple of hundred years, and we have not only this biblical story validated, but if we're talking about David's dynasty in this context, and just a couple of hundred years after his kingdom, we're getting pretty close to a historical David. But there's more. Exciting. This is probably the earliest evidence for David. Again, let me just go back a bit so we have this. So David ruled from about 1010 to 970 BC. So, after David, we had King Solomon. After King Solomon died, he had a son who took over as king. His name was Rehoboam. Rehoboam was not a capable ruler, and so the kingdom was split. Because there was this other guy named Jeroboam. And it's funny how they had similar names. Jeroboam becomes the king. He establishes his dynasty in northern Israel, which became called Israel, and Rehoboam's kingdom continues the Davidic dynasty, and that is the kingdom of Judah. Well, in the Bible, one of the things it talks about is how not too long after Solomon died, not too long after the major player goes away, and all of a sudden we have this kingdom in chaos, there's this Egyptian king that the Hebrew Bible calls him Shishak, Shishak. Now we understand going from one language to another language, pronunciations can change a little, but Shoshenq I of Egypt corresponds to the biblical Shishak. In 925 BC, he raided Palestine. And it talks about how Rehoboam had to give him a whole bunch of gold from the temple. Like, he gave him the gold shields from the temple. I'll show you the passage in a minute. And he had put bronze shields up there. 924 BCE, right before Shoshenq kicked the proverbial bucket, he commissioned a vast triumph scene to be carved on the south wall. Remember I told you Egyptians didn't carve things about their defeats, but they carved things about their victories, and he carved this kind of like bragging thing about I raided Palestine and I took, all this treasure. A group of names that clearly refer to South Judah or the kingdom of Rehoboam. The carving mentions the geographical region called the Heights of David. Some have said this means something like the Heights of Dod, not David. It's a very weak argument. There's no historical evidence for any Dod heights anywhere in that region. And it's been pretty well validated that this fits very hand in glove with the biblical story of the heights, or of the raid by Shoshenq or Shishak of Palestine. Yeah.
For those putting their questions together, can you kind of give us an idea of what time you'll be fielding questions?
Yeah, okay, so we are, what are we at, Matt? We are already at 7:45. Give me about 10 minutes to go through a little data. We're not going to get into next New Testament stuff today. I'm just going to go quickly, and then we'll field questions. Very good. Hopefully you see that we can barely touch the data that exists. This is just kind of meant to whet your appetite for this stuff. This means a mention of King David roughly 46 years after his death, and this corresponds precisely, again, hand in glove with the biblical story. There's a picture of this carving we're talking about. Here's a closer shot of right above there, the Highland of David. It says here, Highland, Heights, English word, different way of talking about this. And I know you can't read the inscription, but this really ain't a secret. So we have excuse me. We have a mention of David, like I say, a mention of King David in the geographical region where he would have been, the Heights of David, 46 years after he died. We don't have a lot of archaeological data for things that is that tight. Here's the biblical story in 1 Kings. In the 5th year of King Rehoboam, Shishak, king of Egypt, came against Jerusalem, took away the treasures from the house of the Lord and the treasures of the king's house. And you can read the rest. The point here being, unless you're going to argue that in the exact same time frame, Shishak is somehow, they made up a king named Shishak who doesn't correspond to Shoshenq. Pretty weak argument. Yeah. So the point here being, this idea that, this minimalist idea that the kingdom of David was a mythological thing, it just don't fit the archaeological data that continues to unfold and unfold. So many things I wish I could talk about, but let me give you one more historical correspondence here. And then after this, we'll call it, and I'll let the questions dictate where we'll go from here. In the days of the Assyrian war machine, northern Israel was conquered, and southern Israel, or Judah, was almost conquered by one Sennacherib, who, here's what Sennacherib did. Here's what the Assyrians did. They were some brutal dudes, all right? I know I don't mean to sound ethnocentric, but I think we can say ethnocentric things against Assyrians nowadays, because that was thousands of years ago, right? But they would they would skin people alive. They would dismember people. They were frightening. People were terrified to death of the Assyrians. And Sennacherib would brag after he conquered a given people group, because here's how his annals would tend to read. I killed all the men, I took all the loot, and I sold all the women, and I took all the women and children into slavery, stuff like that. Again and again and again, he brags about his conquered kingdoms. We have Hezekiah crying out to God because the Assyrians are surrounding Jerusalem. Hezekiah had given Sennacherib gifts. He'd given him treasure. He'd taken all of these other steps to try to get him not to conquer. And this is recorded in the Hebrew Bible. Incidentally, it doesn't exactly put Israel in this big bragging, right? Which gives it a kind of a historical, solid historical flair to it. There's no story where Hezekiah kicks rear on Sennacherib, right? He's He's just in a lot of trouble, but then the angel of the Lord comes out and strikes down 185,000 in the camp of the Syrians. And Sennacherib left and went home after that. And then one of his sons killed him. Okay, how does this relate to the biblical story? Sennacherib is not, and the same thing is recorded in Isaiah. Sennacherib's not going to brag, not going to write, hey, check it out, the God of Israel took me to the woodshed. He's not going to do that. That's not what ancient kings brag about. What he does say, and this is from Sennacherib's hexagonal prism, I think I'm saying that right, there's a little carving of Sennacherib, handsome devil like he was. This prism records the history of his military victories, which were many. And here's what he says about Hezekiah. Hezekiah the Judahite did not submit to my yoke, yada, yada, yada. I did all of this stuff. He talks about how he took away all his booty, all this spoil he grabbed, right? What does he say he did to Hezekiah? Hezekiah himself, like a caged bird, I shut up in Jerusalem in his royal city. This is like Sennacherib's best attempt at bragging about what happened here. Why couldn't he kill Hezekiah? I mean, there's this rinky-dink little city compared to something like Nineveh, which would be the capital of Assyria. He's probably conquered many more powerful foes, including the Babylonians at Babylon and others. But wow, I shut him up. And basically, read the lines there. I couldn't take the city. Why couldn't Sennacherib take Jerusalem? Does this prove that the angel of the Lord killed 185,000 of his soldiers? No, it doesn't prove that. But what it does prove is that, for reasons that would be very difficult from a historical standpoint to explain, Sennacherib couldn't take Jerusalem. He couldn't have Hezekiah. He couldn't dismember Hezekiah or skin him alive like he did to the other kings. All he could do is cage him like a bird. All right. There's more stuff we can talk about. There's New Testament stuff. We can chat about miracles and a number of different things. Time is fleeting. Good questions earlier. I'm glad we started that. But what else? Proviso, I may not know the answers. I'll bet somebody around here does.
Is there any mention, you talked about Moses probably not being the one that's written in any of the earlier Egyptian materials. What about Joseph? Different person, different time, different role.
So far as I've been able to show, there is not clear evidence of Joseph's figure, which is something that we might expect given his magnitude. What has been showed is that we do have capable slaves in Egypt, often promoted to great responsibility. But so far as I know, I don't think we have anything explicit on Joseph. And so it's probably another thing. But here's another thing we do have, Randy, just for grins. One of the things you read about, it doesn't sound like the kind of politics I like, but the Egyptian pharaohs during the famine that it talks about in Genesis, the Egyptian pharaohs got a stranglehold on Egypt because the famine was so severe. But Joseph had saved all his grain for Pharaoh, right? Basically, the ancient pharaohs got to the point where they owned everything in Egypt. They basically the Egyptian nobility sold them their lands, and essentially the Egyptian nobility had to sell themselves into slavery to Pharaoh, giving him an absolute rule in Egypt. However you process this, however we Democrats and Republicans process this today, it was Joseph who enabled the Egyptian pharaohs to have this absolute stranglehold on Egypt. Joseph was a very capable servant. He operated in Pharaoh's behalf, and we do find a socio-political context in Egypt that matches that, where all of a sudden, in the time frame of the pharaohs who Moses and others would have had to do with the Egyptian slaves, we have a very absolute rule on the part of the pharaoh. So it was a little bit more like like a typical king and nobility situation before that came to the point where Pharaoh can essentially declare himself a god because he owns everything and everyone. So Kitchen will deals with that a lot in the book. I can see how one might call that a weak point. It's not. It would be a place where there's not a lot of explicit history to intersect, but
We just haven't found it.
right. And the fact that we haven't found it doesn't mean we won't, because this Tel Dan stela we're talking about the killing of David. I mean, this is like 2011 that was found. So much remains to be, and I don't remember the exact time, but I just read an article by Kenneth Kitchen about a journal article about the Egyptian wall that mentions the heights of David. That's pretty recent too. I mean, that's like within the last 15, 20 years. So a lot of very recent data. Another thing I wanted to mention, not exactly according to your question, but when you look at Egyptian kings and Egyptian nobility in and around the time frame that Moses would have lived in, you're going to see this this syllable in a lot of names. A lot of you have probably heard the name, for instance, Thutmose. So this Moses fit very much in this. It would have been the kind of name we would definitely expect from somebody who is, in the Egyptian court. So. Bill?
A lot of what you talked about, for what people criticize is missing information and interpretation of stuff. I'm not very well versed in this, but is there a lot of arguments that would say that there is existing historical documents that actually contradict stuff that's in history, or is that confirmed?
Not really, Phil. Not a whole lot. I can think of one example, and it's actually a New Testament example. I wasn't going to talk much about the Gospels, and I'm not going to, because Dr. Mark Strauss is going to probably, he's going to talk about the resurrection next week, but he's probably going to talk a little bit about some historical validation for the Gospels, and there's nobody better than Mark Strauss to do that. At least not me. But I do want to mention, I'm going to talk about F.C. Bauer, and this is the other. F.C. Bauer is the Julius Wellhausen of the New Testament. We can chat about him sometime. He was just as historically ignorant as Julius Wellhausen. But this is Sir William Ramsay. Let me just say that Julius Wellhausen, I'm talking about particularly the book of Acts, not Julius Wellhausen. F.C. Bauer really questioned the historicity of Acts. So William Ramsay was educated in the F.C. Bauer School of Historical Criticism and didn't believe in the historicity of Acts. Professor of Archaeology at Oxford University began fully committed to what we call the Bauer thesis, that basically the book of Acts is non-history, historically unreliable. He became convinced of the historicity of Acts through archaeological study in Asia Minor, and here's what he says. Now this has to do with archaeological data, inscriptions, and others, but he says, Luke is a historian, and this is kind of that, he agreed with Bauer before archaeology, historicity of Acts. Luke is a historian of the first rank. Not merely are his statements of fact trustworthy, he is possessed of that true historical sense. He fixes his mind on the idea and plan that rules the evolution of history, the proportions and scale of the treatment to the importance of each incident. He seizes the important and critical events and shows their true nature and greater length, while he touches lightly or omits entirely that which was valueless to his purpose. In short, this author is to be placed along with the very greatest of historians. The biggest historical difficulty I can think is that in the opening of Luke, we have this great census mentioned when Cyrenius was governor of Syria. But Josephus dates that census about 10 years later than we would expect it in Luke. In other words, Jesus was born in the context of this census. But Josephus talks about a great census that happened when Cyrenius was governor of Syria, and it's not a problem that he talks about Cyrenius being governor of Syria, because Cyrenius had 2 terms. One of them would have fit the Luke date, one of them would fit the Josephus date. Josephus is a Jewish historian who's got a lot of corresponding data. So we have a 10-year gap where the census seems to be wrong. It's Josephus' census seems to be too late. We only have two sources for that. We have Josephus, we have Luke. So one or the other of them has to be wrong. Now, this biblical evangelical story has been kicking that around and trying to find a workable thing, and some have posited that there were actually two censuses, which isn't hard to believe that within 2 years there would have been two censuses. More recently, there was an article in the Journal of the Evangelical Theological Society, JETS, a journal article in that argued that Josephus just misdated the Cyrenius census, and he provides a lot of really good data for it. For instance, Josephus misstated a lot of stuff. Nothing against Josephus, but a lot of what Josephus wrote, he's the only source we have for, right? And a lot of the times Josephus corresponds with the Bible. They're the only two sources we have. But we do have evidences where Josephus sometimes just got it wrong by 10 years. And so at least, and this guy gives about 12 reasons why he thinks Josephus misdated that census. So that has been considered to be probably the biggest problem between the Bible and secular history. The census seems to be in the wrong place. And that's really the only place we find Luke falling short. Everywhere else he's right, what you would expect. But if Josephus is right about the census he talks about, it could be another census we just don't know. We have to plead ignorance. Well, maybe there was, maybe there wasn't. If Josephus misstated it by 10 years, which is not at all implausible, then we got no problem. I do want to talk about one. There's so many things in the Gospel of Luke that correspond, but I do want to mention that there's a story where Herod Agrippa is dressed up in his royal robes in Acts 12, and the crowd say, "That's not a man, that's a god." And then worms eat out his insides because he took credit for it. Just for grins, Josephus talks about that too. And while he gives, shall we say, a slightly different interpretation of it, Josephus, and this is in, did I not give you, oh no, I didn't. It's a long passage, all right? And Josephus' Antiquities 19.8.2, Josephus describes the exact same scene. Herod Agrippa standing before the people, dressed up in his royal robes. All of a sudden, he gets a really bad tummy ache that leads to him dying. Josephus validates that people thought he was a god. He was acting like a god. Now, we can't prove that something miraculous happened there. Maybe all of a sudden, it just so happened that when he's wearing his royal robes and accepting worship from the people, maybe some medical thing just happened to coincidentally happen at that time. But Josephus and Luke both interpret this as like a divine judgment for accepting worship that should have gone to the God of Israel. Cool stuff. So there's a lot of validation. There's a lot of crossover, but there's not a lot of contrary data from the secular sources. Now we would expect. Let me say that. We would expect. We wouldn't expect every historical account to be precisely the same in ancient world. That doesn't happen. You know, Herodotus and Livy aren't going to agree in every detail. We're talking about a more macro scale. So those of us who believe that the Bible is the one that's without error, I mean, let's be fair. We are going to tend to believe the Bible as opposed to the other source. But the point is, usually we've got a pretty good correspondence here. Commentator, question?
Yes. Would you address this whole idea that if something is the source, if the source material is oral tradition, does that always argue for myth? Of course, the skeptics would say it argues for myth. For instance, the duration of Noah's flood, the dimensions of the ark. How did those details get to Moses?
Now, of course, the first point is we don't really know. I mean, in terms of that early transmission, we do want to understand that to some degree, Moses is, especially in Genesis, is probably working with earlier traditions that could have been oral or could have been written. We just don't know. It's interesting that the word "these are the generations of Adam" you get these things like these are the generations of Adam, these are the generations of Noah, these are the generations of so-and-so. The word generations there is this Hebrew word running out of space, but toledot. And we do have ancient records called toledotes that tended to be records of genealogies. They were usually written on clay tablets that were stacked up. So genealogical records written on clay tablets in a stack that would say, and typically the top tablet would say something like the toledot of such and such. So that might provide us some sort of a background. We do know that, I'm just going to put this really simply. The fact that we have an oral tradition that was passed down as an oral tradition doesn't automatically invalidate it as something mythological, but it's also very much not necessarily the case if we believe, and we do around here, in things like a historical flood, a historical Adam, stuff like that. There's no particular reason to think there couldn't have been written records that Moses had access to. We're going to have to acknowledge that because, like when Luke writes the Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts, he talks about how he did historical research. The Pentateuch doesn't really have something like that, but it definitely, let me say one more thing about it. And Jay, I'm kind of giving a shotgun here because I don't know that I'm giving a precise answer. But one more thing I want to point out is that what we call ancient Near Eastern creation myths, the Genesis 1 and 2 fit into an ancient literary genre that today we call, not we, but people tend to call ancient Near Eastern creation myths, right? The people who wrote those, they didn't think they were myths, all right? So when we put this in the genre of its time, the Egyptian creation stories, they thought that was the way it happened. The Mesopotamian creation stories, they thought that was the way it happened. These weren't they didn't think of these things. The people at the time didn't think of these things as poems that give some poetic description of how creation happened. They viewed them as their real creation stories. So I think that the other ancient creation myths, if you will, are, and you can see some parallels here. I'm going to argue, and of course I'm coming at this from the perspective of I believe in the Bible, right? Fair enough. I'm going to argue that these are shadows of the original story, and that the Bible gives us the original story. But even like the Egyptian creation myths, Egyptian kings always had a genealogy tracing them back to the creator, God, as they saw it. There's these Egyptian genealogies, and so when we have, say, for example, Abraham is connected to Noah and is connected to Adam by genealogies going all the way back to the original creation. Ancient Near Eastern creation literature, if I'm going to use that word, they almost always trace these things back to the very beginning. Now, the only thing I would say about that is it doesn't prove or disprove the historicity of that stuff. What it does is put it in a literary context, and in its literary context, they didn't think of these stories as phony baloney ways of describing things we didn't understand. They understood these as creation stories. Brother Jay?
Dr. Morris says those tablets would not have had to change hands that many times for them to actually get into the hands of Moses. Even began with Seth, who's in the line of Christ.
Right. We do in our library have a book. Now, one of our guys at the church, Jonathan Neeson, who's not here tonight, he helps with Awana and everything. He's got this book right now, but he's going to bring it back, or I'm going to get it to. He's going to bring it back when he's done with it. He may not be done with it for a while, but we do have a book, and you can get this called the Genesis Record, and this is by Henry Morris, who Jay mentioned, and he talks about the toledotes and the clay records. And now we do want to admit that we are positing plausible theories based on what we know about some ancient transmission records and customs. So we can't exactly prove clay tablets would it be, clay tablets that would have been passed down for some of these genealogical records, but it would fit very well in the historical context. It would flow in. So.
Yeah, historical narrative with absolute dimensions of the ark and wood type and years, that doesn't usually fit in mythical, John.
No, it doesn't. And that's a really important point. The kind of detail we get in some of these ancient stories. I mean, yeah, they didn't usually give these kind of dimensions and this sort of thing. We've got so many hundreds of years of history, so much data, and there's so many things we could talk about. So what I'm hoping you got out of tonight is that if you're interested in the intersection of the Bible and archaeology and ancient documents, it's really something like a bottomless pit, and more is being discovered all the time. And so when I say that a lot of the theories that were hatched in the 17th or 18th or 19th centuries are still peddled as historical fact, when I say those have been challenged and deflated by actual archaeological data that those scholars are just ignoring, most of this data you can see pictures of on the internet. So I'm not saying this I'm not like Julius Wellhausen talking in a vacuum. I mean, when I want these things, when I want to show you the actual things, I just do a Google search and we have a picture. And if you think, well, somebody just doctored that picture for Google, if you have access to an academic library, there are research databases that let you access the journal articles about these things and the archaeological reviews and stuff. I mean, if you know where to look, if you need a little help with that, I might be able to help. If you know where to look, the scholastic, the academic evidence is really not hard to find. So,
what's ironic about this is when they're peddling at universities, it's contradictory to the proper research of what you go through when publishing a paper for class.
Exactly. I mean, you're expected to have footnotes, you're expected to validate. I mean, and I want to be as gracious as I can, but again, I come with strong presuppositions. I believe the Bible is the Word of God, Jesus loves me, this I know, and all that jazz. And I'll acknowledge that these are strong presuppositions. But as an academic who writes papers with Turabian footnotes and stuff like this, I mean, from an academic standpoint, putting the religious questions completely aside, there is just no excuse for what's going on in a lot of the universities with relation to biblical studies. I mean, it's not what's going on in the archaeology departments. They just don't have lunch with the archaeologists. All right. Good time to close with prayer, I suppose. We went over once again and didn't cover all the data once again. Heavenly Father, we love you so much, and I thank you that you've given us scriptures that can be validated, that can be placed in a historical context. It's not that we have all the answers, Lord, but you've given us enough just to show that the writers of the scriptures didn't make things up. There's real history to validate our faith, Lord. We understand that we are a people of faith, that we believe, and that to really know anything does come through faith. But I do think that you have allowed us to connect these dots. I do pray that you will help us to just let these things not be mere academic facts, but let them be things to point us to the fact that you are the God of the universe and that we are accountable to you. And I pray that this will make us want to draw closer to you. In Jesus' name, amen. Once again, Dr. Mark Strauss of Bethel Theological Seminary will be with us next week talking about the resurrection, the historical evidences for the resurrection, and other things. And so please come back next week if you can. We might have some discussion about whether we want to. Some of the questions that have come up here would probably make for some good questions, for some good sessions. So maybe we can extend this whole thing. We'll see. We'll talk about it. But good stuff.
discussion. Thanks.